tests online?
They take their quizzes and stuff online. Yeah. Okay, and let me do this so I don't forget. I always seem to forget to do this part for them too. Okay, so what questions do you have from the last class session where we were talking about taxes? I guess that's the general heading, but specifically, oh gosh, pardon me for just a second. I can't seem to talk and I can't multitask. This is what I meant to do. Okay, so yeah, the general heading taxes, but we were really addressing the question of who pays, who really pays, right? And we had gone through some definitions of some terms. Any questions about definitions of terms or concepts as we laid them out? We also did some graphical analysis. There may be some questions there. I don't know, maybe you're all very, very comfortable with the graphical analysis that we did last time. Any questions about any of that?
Well, I was in macro right when you were doing that, and so like the period before we were doing the same thing.
In macro?
It like macro and micro.
Talking about tax, yeah, I can see doing it in macro. Talking about taxes?
Yeah.
Oh, really? Interesting.
We do this charts, we do interest rates, and we talk about like I've seen too many of those charts.
For the rest of you though, who maybe aren't taking economics right now or haven't recently taken it, any of the things that we laid out last time that you want to ask about? What is a market?
Us.
Well, gotta be a little bit more specific, right? A
The people
market.
you're trying to sell to, or the people that want a specific
I
product.
gave you kind of a working definition of a market last time.
I would say it's almost, you can almost find it similar to like an ecosystem of like consumers and producers.
Okay. Yeah, here's what I'm going to suggest to you as a sort of working definition of, or understanding of what a market is. Try to be as simple as I can with it. A market is a voluntary arrangement of exchange. And I think that word voluntary is important. A voluntary arrangement of exchange. Nobody's going to force you into the market as either a supplier or a demander of a cell phone or a bottle of water or, a car or anything like that, right? So in a capitalist economy, a market is a voluntary arrangement of exchange, which means, as you're kind of getting at, Miles, that you have people who want to supply, who demand it, who want to consume it, right? Demanders, and you have people who are willing to meet that demand by supplying that good to market. Okay? Now, the way that economists graphically represent that market is with a two-dimensional space, right? Where on the vertical axis you have what variable?
Demand.
No, not price. Okay, the price of the good, and whatever market it is that we're talking about. Maybe we're talking about cell phones. Maybe we're talking about bottles of water, whatever. But the price of that good, right? And what's on the horizontal axis? The quantity. Okay, so that if we're trying to represent the demand side of the market, or when economists represent the demand side of the market, they tend to represent that with a downward sloping to the right curve. Okay, which reflects what? The fact that that curve is sloping downward and to the right, okay, in this fashion, right, suggests,
The higher the price, the less people that
and
buy.
what do economists call that?
Elasticity.
No, not elasticity.
Supply and demand curve.
Too much.
Oh,
It's the demand curve, but what is this relationship between price and quantity demanded, such that it's an inverse relationship, so that if price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, or if price goes down, quantity demanded goes up.
So
elasticity.
I'm trying to get you to say the law of demand.
A law of
Okay?
demand.
That's the law of
Law.
demand, okay? Say it again.
The higher the price, the lower the demand.
Yeah, that in other words, at higher price points here, like this is a higher price, here's zero. This is a higher price point here than here, right? Okay, we'll call that price prime, okay? So that if we trace that down to here, right, this quantity is lower than this quantity, right? Is that, there's a less than symbol, right? Okay? That's the law of demand, okay? At lower prices down here, quantity demanded is higher. At higher prices here, quantity is low, okay? So everybody's got that. All right? Oh, I shouldn't have started drawing on the board because I forgot there are no erasers. The supply curve indicates the law of supply, which suggests, my pens don't work either, which suggests that at higher prices, suppliers supply more to market. At lower prices, they supply less to market, right? Isn't that what that indicates? Right? Okay. Now, what do we call the point at which these two curves intersect?
Equilibrium.
Equilibrium output. And I denote that with quantity and a subscript E, right? Equilibrium quantity. And what condition does that satisfy?
That
Is equal to the supply and demand are the same.
It is where the quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, okay? So that's why it's the equilibrium condition, right? And if we trace that over here to the vertical axis, that gives us the equilibrium price, right? And one of the points that we made last time is that it's not the result, the price that prevails out there in the market for gasoline. Have you ever been driving around looking for a gas station to pump a few gallons of gas in your car, and you notice that they're all pretty much priced for unleaded, regular unleaded, the same? That's a competitive market for, at the retail level, a competitive market for gasoline. And it's not because Exxon decides that they're going to set the price at $2.30 or Mobil or whatever the gas companies are decide that they're going to set the retail price. It just sort of happens because of the competition, right? The government certainly doesn't set the price, right? All right, so all of that's just sort of basic supply and demand economics, okay? But it's helpful to us when we start thinking about what government does. Because, for example, we didn't talk about this last time. We were talking about taxes last time, but there are all kinds of ways that government can intervene, potentially intervene. Government could say, for example, that this equilibrium price here is too high and establish a price ceiling here, right? For whatever reason, politicians might do that. And that would have effects on the efficiency of the market, right? Or they could say, the government could say, this price here is too low and establish a price floor here, which would have effects on the efficiency of the market, like a minimum wage, let's say, right? That's a price floor, okay? So we didn't get into all that last time. I'm just trying to, the main point I'm trying to get across to you, we were talking about taxes last time, but government intervention of this type is going to have an effect. It's going to have multiple effects, in fact, but the general effect that we can sort of lump it all into the heading of, it's going to create inefficiencies. Now, if you're a free market economist and you're in love with the idea of the free market, your conclusion may be, oh, government intervention results in inefficiencies, click, 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 bad. But that's a value judgment, right? Because one could just as easily go, oh, okay, it creates some inefficiencies. Well, that's okay because it's promoting other values, like maybe fairness, for example. So I wasn't trying to communicate a message to you last time when I kept saying that, taxes are inefficient. I wasn't trying to suggest to you that they're bad. Okay, what I was trying to suggest to you is that it has some measurable effects in markets. Okay, and the question of whether it's justified, whatever government does with that tax revenue may be a big part of what you conclude about whether it's justified, but it's just a question of competing values. Efficiency is just one value by which outcomes can be judged. Okay? Well, I don't want to belabor that point too much because it's not too long with other stuff, but one of the points that we were trying to make last time is that when government imposes taxes, and we were using an excise tax. Who remembers what an excise tax is? An excise tax. Give me an example of an excise tax.
Oh, cigarettes.
Okay? The tax on cigarettes is an excise tax.
Something you know that like the price isn't gonna help change.
Well, you're talking about another issue. We're going to get to that, but I'm just trying to get you to understand what the basic concept of excise tax is. It is a selective sales tax, as distinguished from the general sales tax, right? The general sales tax is on what's in the tax base in Texas, for example. What is subject to the general sales tax? A lot of stuff that you buy at the retail level, right? Okay, but there are some things that are excluded from that. For example, in Texas, grocery items are excluded from the general sales tax. There are some states where you go into a grocery store and you buy fruits and vegetables, you're still going to pay the general sales tax. You don't do that in Texas. I think the general sales tax applies to processed foods, right? Even if you buy them in a grocery store, but I shouldn't say. I mean, when I say processed, I mean like prepared foods. Like, I think if, for example, if you go into the H-E-B and go to like their deli counter or something like that, and you get something like a sandwich or something that they prepare for you, I think that the sales tax applies to that. But if you buy the fixings yourself, the bread and the cold cuts and whatever else you're going to put in, you're not paying sales tax on that.
What do you pay?
You don't pay any tax. In Texas, grocery items, food items are not subject to the general sales tax. You pay no sales tax. There are some states where you do.
Definitely is an anti.
Because Texas has chosen not to impose the sales tax on food items.
Texas is a really anti-tax state.
Well, that's another question that we need
Well, so
to
the
address.
question is,
Okay.
if they don't charge for the food, what do they charge for? Because obviously they have to charge something.
Yeah, they have to make it.
Somewhere they have to make it back. So where do they?
Well, if you go into H-E-B and you fill your basket up with food items and only food items, grocery items, there's no sales tax. But if you put a Coca-Cola in there, if you put like a bottle of Coca-Cola in there, if you put it like something like saran wrap or garbage bags or something like, all that's going to be subject to the sales tax.
Wow.
Wait, so if I put saran wrap in a bunch of grocery stores, then all that the food's gonna get sales tax?
No.
No,
No, just the items on which the tax is imposed on. Okay? So look, all I'm trying to say to you is the general sales tax is a broad-based tax. An excise tax is a very narrow tax. It's on a specific good, like cigarettes or alcohol or tires. You go buy a new set of tires for your car, you're not paying the 8 1/4 sales tax. You're paying a excise tax on tires, right? Batteries for your car, right? There's quite a few items in Texas that have a special sales tax imposed on them. Now, to get back to the point, is that I like to use a sales tax to make my points about the effects of taxes because it's so much easier using an excise tax than it is using some of these more broad-based taxes. But I do want you to understand that some of the principles that I'm trying to get across to you also apply to broad-based, or they can apply to broad-based taxes. Okay? So the first question that we were addressing really was this question of, does it matter if government imposes a tax on the demand side or the supply side of the market?
No.
Okay? And we determined that it really doesn't. But there's some other concepts that we talked about there that you need to be familiar with. And there we talked about the statutory incidence of the tax versus the economic incidence of the tax. Okay? And we noted that with many taxes, it's possible for the tax to be shifted, the economic burden of the tax to be shifted away from the entity on which the statutory incidence is imposed, the legal responsibility for turning the tax revenue over to government. It may be possible that that economic burden, in other words, who feels the pinch as the result of the tax, the economic pinch as a result of the tax, it may be someone other than, in this case, the retailer or the supply side of the market. Okay? So that's the phenomenon of tax shifting. Okay? And that raises that second question about, well, what does matter? What does determine whether consumers pay relatively more of the economic burden of the tax, or bear more of the economic burden of the tax, or whether the supply side of the market bears the economic burden. And that's where we got into the point about elasticities. And remember, I told you that there are all kinds of elasticities. I only introduced you to what economists call the price elasticity of demand. But there's something called the price elasticity of supply. There are income elasticities. That's for Kyle's macroeconomics class.
Yeah.
Okay?
I see that.
I mean, we gotta, in this course, we gotta put a lid on it somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Okay? And I'm only introducing you to concepts insofar as I think they help drive home a point that I think is important for you to know in this course. Okay? So, what's the bottom line in terms of elasticities? Well, if demand is relatively price elastic, okay? Try to get to the right spot here, I'm sorry. If it's, let's start with inelastic since that comes first. If demand is relatively inelastic, what does that mean? That consumers are not very sensitive to price changes, regardless of the cost of the price change. So it could include the imposition of a tax. Okay? Consumers just don't adjust their consumption that much. There's a formula for computing elasticity, and I'm resisting with all my might the temptation to put that out there for you, okay? Because I just don't think it's that relevant in this course for us to be able to compute the elasticity. It's not a complicated computation, but really it's a question about how much does quantity demand change in relation to a change in price. So for example, if price changes by, say, 10%, does quantity demanded change by something less than 10%, exactly 10%, or something more than 10%? If it changes by something more than 10%, then we say it's price elastic. If it's less, we say it's inelastic. If it's the same, we say it's unit elastic, which is a term we didn't introduce last time, right? It's okay. You don't have to remember it certainly for the purpose of this course, but yes, it's unit elastic. Okay? But you understand, like, as a percentage, does price change, does quantity demand change by relatively more or relatively less than the percentage change in price? For whatever reason, price changes, including a tax imposition. Okay? So if, as a percentage, quantity demanded doesn't change as much as the percentage change in price, it's inelastic. Consumers just aren't that sensitive. It's going to change some, but not a lot. It would have to be perfectly inelastic not to change at all. Okay? No matter how much price changes, consumers keep on consuming the same amount. That would be perfectly inelastic. Notice the word is relatively inelastic. Okay? As you probably have learned at this point in your education, at least in your social sciences courses, it's always gray, right? It's never just black and white. Okay? So the concept of relatively is pretty important here. Okay? Relative to what? Oh, quantity demanded relative to percentage change in price. But anyway, the bottom line then is, as we observed last time, if it's relatively inelastic, then that's probably going to mean that consumers take the biggest hit. The consumers bear the biggest brunt of the economic burden of this tax. And the example that we used last time was, I think, cigarettes, right? Okay? It is probably the case that when government increases the cigarette tax, okay, that smokers keep on smoking, okay? I suppose, as with anything, you could reach a point where it would have some perverse effect. Like, say, for example, if the government increased the excise tax on a pack of cigarettes so much that it might provide an incentive for a black market, right? Like, like people might start selling cigarettes on the street corner to avoid the tax.
Selling cigarettes on the street?
I think that happens, for example, in places like New York City, where, by the way, the cigarette tax is pretty high, right? and you drive or walking down the streets in New York, Manhattan or whatever, and there are guys standing out on the corner selling in the corner selling cigarettes.
Well, where did they get them? If they come, if they
We don't ask those kinds of questions.
And buy them in bulk?
Well, there's smuggling things, you know.
Maybe there's some illegal procurement. I don't
Wait,
know.
is that illegal to sell cigarettes?
Maybe they go to a state like South Carolina where the cigarette tax is really low, and they've calculated that they can just drive them back in a van and still make a profit. It doesn't have to be illegal. I mean, it's illegal in the sense that they're avoiding the cigarette tax in New York. They're avoiding that, cigarette tax that's imposed. That's illegal, to sell those on the street corner without paying the tax.
Really?
It's illegal enough.
Well,
it's
sure.
like, if I buy something that's my property and I sell it to
If
someone.
you go into a retail store here in Texas and you buy a furniture item and the owner of the store says, you know what, I'm just going to take care of that sales tax for you. You walk out with a sneaking suspicion that that guy's probably not paying the sales tax, right?
Yeah, but you paid the sales tax in another state though, the cigarette smuggler.
Yeah, but they didn't pay to New York.
But
Yeah,
he's,
So it's legal.
but the tax is imposed on the sale, the retail sale, not the hotel, not the wholesale sale. It's on the retail sale, and that retail transaction is occurring, in my example, in New York. So that's where the tax is imposed. That's the jurisdiction that has the authority to impose the tax. And if you're avoiding that tax, you're committing a crime.
But that doesn't make sense because he bought it from the retailer and paid tax.
In the
But he's giving it second, he's selling it secondhand.
Yeah.
Why would he have to pay tax on a secondhand sale?
Because
He's not a store, he's just selling.
You know these resale shops that you see around here? Do they pay sales tax?
Yeah.
Of course, it's a second sale. It's
Yeah,
a
but-
second-hand sale.
They're not, yeah, but it's so weird because he could be like one person, they're a wholesale store.
Okay, anyway,
Yeah.
well, I'm gonna have to put that on the back burner, okay? Everybody get the point here about inelastic demand. Okay, what about elastic demand? That means that consumers are very sensitive to price changes, that as a percentage change, demand changes by a whole lot relative to a small increase or decrease in price, okay? Consumers are very sensitive, and we would expect in that circumstance for the supply side of the market to bear the economic burden of that tax, okay? And the example I gave last time is bottled water. Do you understand what I mean by the economic damage of that tax? You see, because what's going to happen if the government imposes a 50-cent per bottle tax on water? I'll give you a better example. Let's say the state of Texas imposes an excise tax of $1 on vending machine transactions. Okay? So that when you go buy your Kit Kat bar or your Three Musketeers or your chili Fritos or whatever it is that you buy out of the vending machine, whereas formerly you were paying $1.25, now it's $2.25. And now you say, forget it, I'm not buying the chili Fritos. Is there something called chili Fritos?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Those are the best ones.
Okay, so you just don't buy it. You still have your $2.25, so you're no worse off. But Frito-Lay is worse off because now you and people like you who are no longer buying their products out of the vending machines, and certainly the person who owns and operates the vending machine is taking an economic hit. Whereas that guy might have been collecting $1,000 a week out of that vending machine. Now, that's probably, I don't know if that's even close, but let's say collecting $1,000 out of that vending machine. Now he's only collecting $150 out of that vending machine. Right? You see the economic damage that's done by that ridiculous example that I gave you of an excise tax. Yeah.
So you're saying like in relatively elastic markets, you would say that higher taxes damages the economy.
They all damage the economy. Well, look, again, we're only thinking about the effects of the tax, and we're not taking into consideration what government does with the tax revenue. Because remember, there's going to be another side of that coin. Government is going to do something with that tax revenue.
Oh, 'cause
So there are
it's-
benefits to be derived from that. But at least in terms of this, I would just agree with your statement if you took the word economy out and put in the word market. Does that make sense? That market is going to be
that
damage. Damage is kind of a pejorative term. That there's going to be an effect in that market. Okay? I didn't even introduce you to the concept of excess demand or excess burden last time. But again, when you take your microeconomic class like Kyle, you'll learn about excess burden. Economics can be a very useful, particularly in my view, microeconomics can be a very useful course for you. I still think about it. I still think about my experience as many years ago as it was that I took introductory microeconomics. I still count it among one of the most valuable courses I took as an undergraduate.
It has helped a lot, like understanding business in general, just because, and I'm doing great, honestly, it's one of like the best classes I'm doing.
It may depend on who you have as an economics professor, because some economics professors teach economics as sort of like it might be taught at a business school, and others teach it like a social science. It is more properly a social science. I will fight Varun Gupta on that. On that issue.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm joking. He and I do have a little bit of a disagreement. He treats it like a business, like a business school class, and I argue it's really a social science. It's really the study of how people make decisions, most general thing that we can say. But the emphasis, whether it's a social science emphasis or a business school emphasis, is going to make a difference in the kind of approach.
I
The kind of course.
enjoy it. It's not a class that I don't like.
That is 100%.
So would it be a good
Okay.
class to take even if you're not gonna go into business?
I think so. I didn't go into business. Okay. All right. So everybody clear on the concept of tax shifting,
Yes.
right? Okay. Now, look, I'm going to say something here since we're talking about business and business school. So I'm going to say something that's going to offend all of you business school people. Or I tell you what, let me say it this way. I have a feeling that if I were to go before a group of business leaders, say they invite me in, hey, Fagan, we understand that you have background in economics, you have, written this paper, that paper, whatever, and we'd like you to come and give a little talk on taxes. I say, sure, I love talking about taxes. I can't try to stop me. And here's what I lead with. I go in and say, in the United States, businesses do not pay taxes. I have a feeling that everyone in that audience is going to immediately tune me out. You're not going to listen to another thing I say. In fact, they might ask me to leave. Get out of here. What are you talking about? Because business people, and particularly small business people, are convinced that they pay way too much in taxes. Right? That there's every sort of tax. They're just inundated with taxes. Don't tell me that we don't pay taxes. Look, what I'm trying to tell you is that taxes affect people. People pay taxes. Right? That's an important point. Businesses do not pay taxes. The effects of taxes, and we've been talking about just sort of the negative effects of taxes in that they reduce efficiency and so on. Those economic effects are always borne by people. And so any tax that's imposed on business is always going to be shifted. It's always going to be shifted. It's either going to be shifted forward to the consumer in the form of higher prices for the goods and services that the business supplies to market, or it's going to be shifted backward to the owners of the businesses in the form of lower profits, or to the employees of the business in the form of lower wages, or perhaps some combination of those things.
Yeah.
That's what I mean when I say that the economic effects of taxes are always felt by people. Businesses don't feel the effect of taxes. Okay? That's a social science economist view of the world, not a business school view of the world. So, for example, and we can talk about this in areas other than taxes. For example, I mentioned the minimum wage a few minutes ago. You oftentimes in this debate over increasing the minimum wage, business owners will come out and say, well, it's going to mean higher prices for consumers. You see, they understand that. There is an economic inefficiency that is associated with increasing the minimum wage, and it may mean higher prices for the goods and services that their customers buy. It may also mean also mean a cutback in hours for employees or fewer employees being hired, right? Which means less income to labor. That question can only be sorted out by looking at the data, because there's a debate every time there's some proposal to increase the minimum wage. There's always a debate over whether it will increase income to labor or whether it will decrease income to labor. It really just depends on, certainly the people who have jobs and who have jobs that are minimum wage jobs, it's going to increase their income. If it does result in higher unemployment, then there's a decrease to labor because now you have people employed. The question is, which is a greater effect?
And then now there's also the threat of, if it gets too expensive, it could be cheaper for some businesses to just, if they can't hire, get robotic hires, basically.
They move to capital. It becomes a more capital intensive operation.
Yeah, I mean, you just can't create money out of thin air, so, I mean, you have people that are like, let's up the minimum wage, but where are you getting it? And then the value of that job is supposed to go up, and then now it kind of.
I'm gonna tell you this, because we gotta move on and finish our conversation about taxes. But on this point, since you all seem to be interested in it, I'm gonna tell you, I try to be as objective about these things as I possibly can. The argument that an increase in minimum wage will increase income to labor is theoretically valid. The argument that an increase in the minimum wage will result in a decrease in income to labor is also theoretically valid. Okay, if there's enough job losses as a result of it, it can only be sorted out in terms of looking at the data. Okay? In popular debate, political debate over the question, just like in the debate over taxes, what are the effects of taxes going to be? Oftentimes, the theoretical arguments and the hypothetical arguments and the delusionary arguments that people make based on speculation are often more important than what the data tells us. Okay?
Two good points around.
Uh-huh.
One, I wondered if you increase the minimum wage, let's say to 15, won't inflation start if everybody can buy everything, won't supply those change?
Again, an argument that some people will make in response to a proposal to increase the minimum wage is that it's inflationary. There may be some, all other things being equal, there may be some inflationary effects. The one question is, can we absorb those inflationary effects? Can we take those inflationary effects because the good or the benefit that results from an increase in the minimum wage outweighs those inflationary effects? Another consideration is, are there steps that can be taken to, if you raise the minimum wage and there is inflationary pressure, are there steps that you can take to counter the inflationary pressure? It's very complicated.
Yeah. And then the last one is, let's say you're a welder and you make $18 an hour, and then now someone, a 12-year-old, or excuse me, a 17-year-old works at McDonald's makes 15. Would they have to increase the?
If you're a welder that's making $18 an hour, I think you're being underpaid.
Exactly, and that's what there's a lot of people that.
No, welders probably make about $45 an hour.
That's another thing that would result is people who are making $15, $16, $17 at decent jobs are gonna be like, hey, now McDonald's workers making as much as me. We're gonna.
It may have some general upward pressure on wages generally.
Generally, yeah.
But maybe not. Maybe not. I mean, again, those kind of questions can only be answered by looking at the data. When in the past, when we've had a $1.50 increase in the minimum wage or a $2 increase in the minimum wage, and understanding we have to control for all these other variables and so on that are going on, what have been the effects? Yes, sir.
I think that's kind of what makes having different states useful, is their ability to control taxes and put certain caps on how much someone can pay, or need that they be paid more, because you could look, okay, well, how's this economy that has higher minimum wage compared to this state that has lower?
That's true.
minimum wage?
That's true.
Instead of having
You
all
have, because
units.
you have different control groups, that's different
Yeah.
states have different things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like any kind of human, one of the reasons that people are so skeptical about the social sciences is because there are so many variables when we're talking about human behavior that enter into play. And you can't, it's not like a laboratory science where you can physically control the variables, right? You can only sort of statistically control the variables. So it's very difficult to say with certainty a lot of times what the effects of this will be or what they could be. You know, if we do X, what will happen? It's very difficult oftentimes. Okay? All right, let's move on because there are other things that we need to talk about here. All right, so we've dealt with the question who really pays and the subsidiary question, does it matter who the government imposes the statutory incident of the tax on? We said no, it doesn't matter. What does make a difference is elasticities. And we talked specifically about the price elasticity of demand, okay? And a lot about this idea of tax shifting, okay? Let me ask you this before we move on to this question number 2. Who is the statutory incidence of property taxes imposed on?
Property owner.
Property owners, right? Now, what most people think about when they think about the property tax is home, residential property, you know, homes, for example, single-family homes. And the question of whether a homeowner living at the property that they own can shift the burden of that tax somewhere else, we'll put that aside, okay, and go for something a little bit easier right now. How about multi-unit residential properties, apartments?
Yeah,
Okay?
Okay.
Is the property tax imposed on?
no.
It is. It is.
But the
The property owners of apartment complexes pay property tax. The
Oh, yeah,
statutory
because they
incident.
own it. It's not just
But-
people.
The question about who really pays
rent.
the,
Rent.
well, are you sure? See, that's the impulse that we have. And anybody who's ever lived in an apartment complex and their landlord has come to them and said, hey, I'm going to have to raise your rent, taxes are increasing, right?
Uh-huh.
Probably comes away with, well, of course I'm paying. You know, I think I've told you all in a previous class meeting that I used to be an analyst for the city of Fort Worth.
Yeah.
And I've told you, I think, that, you know, I would go in occasionally and talk to the mayor. Had to have a conversation, always remember this, I had to have a conversation with the mayor one day because she had made a public statement that renters don't pay taxes. Or don't pay property taxes. Renters don't pay property taxes. I said, Mayor, you're making a lot of renters angry because a lot of renters are convinced that they pay property tax. She says, well, they don't pay. The owners of the apartments pay the tax. I say, well, they are certainly responsible for legally remitting the property tax.
Yeah.
But it may be that the economic burden of that property tax on rental property is borne by the renter, or at least some portion of it. And so I shared with her, by way of illustration, my best attempt, which is, you know, imagine a community where there are a number of apartment complexes, and the owner of one apartment complex comes to the renters and they say, well, we're raising your rent because property taxes are going up. What do you think those renters might do? They might move, right? Now, if there's lots of vacancies of these other apartment complexes, then it may be that the property owner will have to rethink that and say, well, I guess I'll just eat the economic burden of this tax, right? Because I can't afford to lose my renters, right? But if there aren't a lot of vacancies, right, the landlord may say, sure, go see if you can find another apartment. Good luck, right? I'm still going to raise the rent, right? You see what I'm saying? Like it has a lot to do with the market conditions in this specific example that I'm talking about. if you have a community where there are lots, at any given time, there are lots of available apartment units, there's probably a pretty good chance that the property owner is bearing the economic burden of that property tax. But if there are not a lot of vacancies, not a lot of options for renters, then they probably are able to pass or shift a good chunk of that burden on to renters. And then the same thing with hotel motel occupancy tax, right? It's not a general sales tax when you rent a hotel room, okay? It's an excise tax, right? So again, imagine two communities, one where there's a thriving convention center business, a tourist business, and on any given night, it may be really, really hard to find an available hotel room if you're driving through town, right? And in the second community, you have, on any given night, an over availability of hotel rooms, right? And which of those two is it more likely that the renter is paying the tax? Well, in the first one, right? And in the second one, it's more likely that the hotel owner operator is taking the economic hit, okay? All right, so it's not just excise. It's not just sales taxes or excises. Property taxes, for example, may be shifted. One of the things that people don't really realize about property taxes is that it's not just on residential property, it's also on commercial industrial property. So, for example, if you have a community that has a sort of a thriving industrial complex, manufacturing center or something like that, they produce lots of goods and services, right? And they move, they ship those all across the country. They may be able to shift. It's not a deliberate act on their part. That's what I keep saying. They may be able to shift it. It's not something to say, well, we're going to shift the burden of this tax. It just happens, right? But, it may be that the economic burden of that tax is being paid by people from out of state, right? It's being exported to people out of state in the form of higher prices for the goods and services that are being manufactured here locally. Right? On the other hand, if the demand for their goods and services of the products that they're producing are slumps, then they're probably going to have the economic burden of that tax. Or maybe the workers in the form of higher or lower wages, right? That's very, again, pretty complicated to sort out who's really feeling the burden, the economic burden associated with taxes. But one of the things that I can tell you for sure, that even if the Chamber of Commerce asked me to leave in the middle of my speech, is that businesses don't pay tax.
Someone does, but
Their customers, the owners, the employees. Okay, let's move on to this next question, all right? How is the tax burden distributed specifically in Texas, okay? So here I want to introduce a couple of new concepts to you, okay? Got to distinguish between something called the effective tax rate and the nominal tax rate, okay? The effective tax rate, if you, look, be very careful here that you understand the effective tax rate as we're defining it right now. Because if you go out and Google effective tax rate, and like for a versus pair or something like that, and you write up what you find from your Google search, it's probably not going to be consistent with this. Okay, so the effective tax rate is the percentage of an individual's or a household's income paid in taxes, as distinguished from the nominal tax rate, which is the rate that's imposed by law. So for example, in Texas, we've said that the nominal tax rate, sales tax rate, state sales tax rate is 6 1/4, and local governments, of course, may have an option which could bring it up to a maximum of 8 1/4. And when the sales tax rate is applied to a retail sale, it is applied at 6 1/4 or 8 1/4 or whatever the case is, irrespective of the consumer's income. It's not like you go to the store and buy an item And they ring it up and they say, oh, wait, there's a matter of the taxes. How much is your annual income? Because we got to figure out your tax rate. And it's just the nominal tax rate is constant across all retail transactions, right? But economists, and we are more interested in the question of how tax burdens are distributed. We are more interested in the concept of an effective tax rate. How many of you have ever run into this distinction before? Okay. You bet you have, because we talked about it at least briefly earlier this semester when we were dealing with Daniel Ellisar's culture types. Remember, we said that Ellisar argues that traditionalistic political cultures are more likely to have regressive tax structures. Okay. So what's the distinction mean? Well, it has to do with the relationship between an individual or household's income and their effective tax rate, such that if we're talking about a progressive tax, it's a direct relationship. Okay? So in other words, as household income increases, the percentage of income paid in taxes also increases. Progressive taxes means that they're moving in the same direction. So the opposite side of the coin would hold then. As household income goes down, the percentage of income paid in taxes also goes down. An example of a tax that is progressive is the federal income tax. Although I've noted there, the asterisk indicates that it's only marginally progressive. Let me ask you this question. Let's digress here for just a moment before we go to regressive tax. Tell me what you think it looks like with the federal income tax. The relationship between income, as we go this way along the horizontal axis, income is increasing, right? And as we go this way, what does effective tax rate mean? The percentage of income paid in taxes, right?
Yeah.
What do you expect this looks like? How many of you think it looks like this? Okay, one person? Two people? Okay, so the more you make, the more you pay at a constant rate.
Correct.
Okay? How many of you think, no, that's not right? It probably looks more like this. That it increases, the effective tax rate increases as income increases, at first very slowly, but then as you get into higher levels of income,
10, 12, 22.
Yeah, I think this is.
you think it's more like that. It's kind of an exponential function.
It has a curve.
Okay?
Yeah.
It does jump up though.
What about this? Who thinks it looks like that? One person, okay? That it increases rapidly at lower levels of income, but then at higher levels of income, it levels off.
No, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it. The reason why I said that is I was looking at the
Yeah,
tax
right.
bracket trying to calculate my taxes, and I noticed at a higher level, it stays right there and it just plateaus.
I heard you say bracket, so I'm going to suggest to you how it actually works. What it actually looks like. Okay. The reason I say it's marginally progressive, the word marginal here means, or if you've ever heard the expression at the margins, okay?
Yeah.
It means for the extra amount, right? So it's actually looks something like this. The current 2020 tax brackets look like this,
Yes.
okay? So in the range of income from $0 to $9,875, the tax rate is 10%. Okay? Over $9,875, so $9,876 to $40,125, it goes to 12.
Yep.
Okay? But that's only on the income from $9,876 to $40,125. Over the first $9,875 of income, they're only paying 10%. In other words, you see what I'm saying? Like, imagine a person who has an annual income of $40,000. Okay? They're paying a 10% tax rate basically on the first $10,000, and they're paying a 12% tax rate on the remaining 30%. Okay? Everybody with me? It's marginally progressive. Okay? So that the next bracket is $40,126 to $85,525. And over that range of income, somebody who's in that income bracket would be paying 22% on that range, but only 12% on this range here and only 10% on this range here.
It's weird that you pay all of them. Each bracket, trying to move up, you still have to pay the previous brackets.
Look, let me get to the bottom line here.
Which is
Look,
good.
let me get to the bottom line here. Okay, so the top tax rate currently, marginal tax rate is 37%. So imagine a person who makes $520,000 a year, or who has an income of $520,000 a year. They are not paying 37% on $520,000.
They pay each bracket.
They're paying 10% on this range, 12% on this range, 22% on this range, and so on. Right? They're only paying 37% on the amount over $518,401. Okay?
Yeah.
So it's marginally progressive. It's not progressive throughout.
That's exactly what I was agreeing with you. because-
Okay?
So.
That's the way the federal income tax code works.
So for that amount, so they still have to pay that 10% tax, but only between that amount of money.
The first $10,000 they make, they pay 10%.
Okay.
And the next $40,000 they make 12%.
Right.
And then it goes, which is kind of interesting at the same time, because for a long time, people think that if you're a millionaire, you're just gonna pay 37% of your taxes.
Yeah, but as I've said, perception is often wrong, but it is really in some ways what informs what happens in the political arena more than the reality. Right?
Why do they do it like that?
Well, that's again a complicated question, but some of you may be aware that the tax rates have changed some. For example, during in 2014, the highest tax rate was 39.6, and then of course when Donald Trump was president, they changed the tax rates, right, so that now the top rate is 37%. You can see the differences here. Not only have the brackets changed, but the rates have changed, and the amount, the range of income over which people at the upper end of the income scale are paying higher taxes have been truncated. Right?
That's a very weird number.
What's that?
It literally said, it was like $1,000 little slot that you were the cutoff point between something else. It was weird.
Yeah,
This one, 401,000 to like 405,000 during this bracket.
Yeah, some of the brackets are real wide, and some of them are real small.
Can you imagine? Wait, please don't pay me $24. I need to stay right back.
The answer to your question, I think, is that very careful calculations are done about how much revenue comes from each of these tax brackets, and how can you maximize revenue at, given this rate or that rate. Certainly much more complicated than I can explain to you, even if I had a week to explain to you. I think it's that's why we have tax accountants.
Yes.
The whole profession of tax accountants wouldn't exist if it wasn't for this tax structure here. If we had people pay a flat tax with no deductions and no exclusion. By the way, those numbers that I just gave you assume no exclusions. That's only on taxable income, right?
Yeah.
It's not like you have somebody who has annual income in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's not based on their gross income, it's based on their taxable income, right? And that's why that's why the whole profession of tax accounting exists, is to find ways for people to not pay taxes.
Yeah, like don't a lot of people, like millionaires in certain tax brackets, don't they find ways to pay less taxes? I
Sure.
think, because they won't actually be taking an official income, but they will be getting money from a different source that's not taxable.
Yeah, there's definitely incentives in the federal tax code for people to hide income, or hide sounds so. It sounds so. Yeah, I mean, it sounds so. They're perfectly legal. Well, I should say to protect income,
How do you?
to evade paying taxes or avoid paying taxes.
Yeah.
In fact, Donald Trump said that makes you a hero if you can find ways to avoid paying taxes. Remember when Donald Trump said that? It makes me a great guy because I can find ways to avoid paying taxes. All right, a regressive tax, on the other hand, is just the opposite. Okay? household income decreases, the effective tax rate goes up.
Wow, wow, wow.
Or if you prefer, household income increases, the effective tax rate goes down. So that the burden of the tax rests more heavily on lower and middle income groups than on upper income groups, okay? So an example of a tax that is regressive, and again, this is not politically motivated, it's not a Democratic position or a Republican position or a liberal or conservative position. It is, anybody who knows anything about taxes will tell you that sales taxes are regressive. And maybe that's okay. It just depends, maybe, certainly depends on your political views, but it may depend on where you are on the income scale, whether you think that's okay. Or where you want to be on the income scale. Or where you see yourself being on the income scale. Some people are delusional about where they are in terms of their economic status. Okay, so state general sales tax and excise taxes, like we've been talking about so much over the last couple of class meetings, no question that they are regressive. Something like the cigarette tax in particular is regressive. Okay, questions about that?
To me, it almost seems like in regressive, it's almost like an incentive to be more successful, make more money because you pay less. Well, you pay more tax than someone who makes less money, but your tax rate is low.
Yeah, I mean, really what we're talking about here when we talk about the progressive versus regressive thing is it cuts ultimately to a question about fairness. And unlike efficiency, which can be measured, and losses in efficiency, which can be measured, fairness cannot be measured. Is it fair for the government to take $1 out of my paycheck and give it to your grandmother in the form of a Social Security benefit? Well, if you love your grandmother, you may think that it's very fair, but I don't know your grandmother from, so I may not think it's fair, right? So the problem is that it's hard, you can't really measure fairness. And so ultimately that cuts to what people's political views are, okay? But just to make sure everybody's clear on why this is regressive, so imagine two individuals. I'm going to keep the numbers real simple here, even if they're not realistic. Imagine an individual who has an annual income of $10,000 and a second individual who has an annual income of $100,000, okay? And they both go into the Walmarts or whatever the retail stores are, and they buy the same bundle of goods, okay? Subject to the sales tax, such that they both make $1,000 worth of purchases. So at 8 1/4, what would the tax liability be here? Somebody do that arithmetic for us. $1,000 worth of purchases at 8 subject to the sales tax over the course of the year, 8 1/4%. Oh, yeah, it's easy. Let's make it 10%.
1,825.
On $1,000 worth of
Oh, I'm sorry. 1080.
Is that the problem is that that's an unrealistic number? Let's make it a more realistic number. $10,000 worth of purchase.
Okay, so now it would be 1080.
It would be what?
In total, it would be 1080. 1,000.
Of the tax liability? 8 1/4% on 10,000 would be what?
$825.
Oh, I'm sorry, $825.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah, I was adding them together.
And what would it be here? Well, $825.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Now, is $825 a bigger percentage of 100,000, or is it a bigger percentage of 10,000?
10,000.
So the effective tax rate is higher here than it is here.
Theoretically.
No, not theoretically, really.
Yeah.
Really, that's the whole point about a regressive tax.
If they spend the same amount.
Yeah,
then
that's
you
the
have-
hypothetical
if you-
part.
If you have more money, you generally would probably spend more money.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the hypothetical part, but, here's a counterpoint to that some people are gonna make is that people at the low end of the income scale are spending a much higher percentage of their income from month to month on items that are subject to the sales tax than people at this part of the income scale,
That's what we're
right?
talking about. the
Think about
LeBron
people who are living from paycheck to paycheck, and they go to the stores and they spend their entire paycheck at the stores just to provide for their families. There's a high percentage of their income that's going subject to the sales tax, whereas the percentage of income here is much lower, right?
That's what LeBron James is talking about. He's paying the same price for toothpaste that we're paying, but he's paying the same amount of tax that we're paying.
But I thought you said that Texas had a, sales tax where they didn't tax you on like basic food items, something like that.
Well, I'm saying items that are subject to the sales tax.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, items that are subject to the sales.
Yeah, LeBron James should be paying $3 for toothpaste like me. Because you have higher, because he's in a higher
You're
bracket.
imagining some kind of, well, you know what? My guess is he probably doesn't pay $3 for a tube of toothpaste. He probably buys his toothpaste at some high-end retailer that
Probably gets it from the oral.
it's laced with,
Probably
you know,
make it.
Honestly, if he says I'll support you.
But you get the idea.
yeah, I do, yeah.
You know.
But do you all understand the point that I'm making here, that
Absolutely.
there's no question that it's aggressive. And here's, look, let me just show you this little bit of evidence here because we're running out of time. And I think I might have showed you some version of this earlier in the semester, okay? When we start looking at data in the aggregate, it becomes clear. So for example, here in Texas, and these numbers are from the Center for Public Policy Priorities in a publication called Who Pays Taxes in Texas. You can see that the lowest income group, the people whose income is less than $27,088, pays an effective sales tax rate, sales and excise tax rate of about 12.5%. Whereas people up here at the upper end, whose incomes are greater than 117,000, are only paying just under 5% effective tax rate. So that downward sloping phenomenon is the essence of a regressive tax.
Is it based on consumer behavior?
Sure, but again, that's why we don't take total purchases as the measure or something like that. I do understand your point, Miles, but what we're taking here is the effective tax rate, and that is the percentage of income paid in sales tax. Okay? And then, of course, you also have to bear in mind that, just to throw in one other little complicating factor, is that people at the upper end of the income scale are much more likely to have their sales tax liability from the state deducted when they itemize their federal income tax return. People at the lower end of the income scale generally don't itemize.
That's true. Yeah. Older people tell me that you should keep receipts and all this stuff, so at the end of the year, I might they'll deduct that.
Well, the tax code is such that there's an incentive for people at the lower or maybe even lower middle income groups to just take the standard deduction on their federal income tax as opposed to trying to itemize, but that's a whole other issue. Okay, look, let's just touch on a couple of things in about the 2 or 3 minutes that we have left here. I want to make sure we touch on a couple of other things here real quick. I gotta find them though first. Okay, so one of the things that we've said previously is that Texas depends heavily on the general sales tax, okay, and excise taxes. In fact, about 53% of the revenue that's generated by taxes in the state of Texas, these are numbers are a little bit old, but I don't think they've changed very much. Well over half of the tax revenue in Texas is generated through sales and excise taxes, okay, or excuse me, the general sales tax. And then there's another chunk of it that comes from excise taxes like motor fuels tax and tobacco taxes. there's, oh, here's a pie chart that kind of makes that point, right? Here's the big chunk that's coming from sales tax. Okay, so given the fact that such a huge chunk of the sales, of the tax revenue in Texas comes from sales tax, tells us that the tax code in Texas is going to be regressive. All right? And then you can see all these other excise taxes in here that make up a huge chunk of the tax revenue as well. So it's really not just 56%, it's 56% plus this 10% plus this, so on, right? Okay. What else can we say? There was a time when Texas was heavily dependent on oil and gas severance taxes for revenue. That changed in the 1980s. I think I might have mentioned this to you in the previous class meeting. In the 1980s, you had this oil bust, right, where the price of oil went from like $28 to $8 in a very short period of time. And you can see here that this is the point where you start seeing the huge hit to the state budget. And as a result, the legislature started trying to diversify the Texas economy and the tax base of Texas and not depend so heavily on oil and gas severance taxes. But we still have them, okay? We still have them, and the authors of your textbook, I think, maybe give you some explanation of how those work. If not, don't worry about it, okay?
What do we do now?
Oil.
What
What?
else do we do besides oil?
Well, we have a much more items subject to excise taxes and of course, we still have the sales tax.
Oh,
We're
okay,
just,
nothing like, okay,
Yeah,
we're still a big.
okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's a panoply of taxes. Let's just finish up on this point here. There's a panoply of taxes other than just the general sales tax. There are all these excise taxes, cigarette taxes, alcohol taxes, hotel, motel occupancy taxes,
14%.
taxes on insurance premiums, taxes on utilities, taxes on attorney services.
Let me
Right?
write that down.
Those are all excise taxes. And, we were talking a little bit last time about how Texas compares to the other states in some of these. I guess since the big one is the sales tax, we'll just end on this point here. On average, the general sales tax rate in Texas is 8.14. Okay, it can be a maximum of 8.25, but in some places it's 8.25. In some places it's 6.25. In some places it's 7, right, or 7.25. So on average it's 8.25, and that means Texas is at the high end of the states, right? It's 11th in terms of the highest average sales tax rate. Okay. All right. I wish we could go on with it, but we're out of time. Okay. So we'll see you on
Hawaii is a
Tuesday.
4.35.
What?
Hawaii is 4% tax.
Wow.
That's what. Yeah, 4.35. That's what it says.
Wait,
Look at Arizona, $9.
Alaska is
9%.
1.74?
It's because only penguins live there, bro.
Who lives in
You
Alaska?
think penguins are buying PS5?
Who lives in Alaska? Not many.
How many penguins do you know that live in McDonald's? Come on.
It wouldn't make much money because they have such a low population.